Chapter 9 of Clearing Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rutger. Clearing Weather by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 9. Wickananish. The keen breezes of autumn in New England and the languorous softness of the West Indian early winter had been changed now for something which called itself summer, and which offered hail giving place to snow, and chilly fog only yielding to furious gales with driving squalls of cutting rain. This was the mildest season for vessels to brave the stubborn resistance of the seas which washed Cape Horn. When mist or rain or driving snow parted long enough to afford any extended view, Michael, on the slippery wind-swept deck of the Jocasta, could see the enormous gray rollers looking as though they must be a mile at least between crest and crest, moving past in untiring procession. Up one long slope the Jocasta would toil and climb, with the wind drumming at her taut, close-reefed canvas, to labor across the summit and go plunging down and down, then to begin the long upward struggle once more. Only exactly the right wind would carry them through the more sheltered Straits of Magellan, and this wind having been denied them, they were obliged to face the full force of the screaming gales as they doubled the Cape. It seemed that it must have been in some other existence that they had lain in the dreamy waters of that West Indian bay, and had finally determined to set their course into the stormy unknown. They had run back across the Caribbean to Port-au-Prince to take on provisions and to gather such cargo as might be of use to them at their remote destinations of the northwest coast and China. The Carib trader had referred them to a dusky partner of his own on the island of Guadalupe, from whom Michael purchased a still greater quantity of the delicate shell money, upon which even Captain Douglas looked with some misgiving. "I suppose you know what you're doing," he said doubtfully, "but it seems strange to me that such valueless stuff should be given cargo room and be carried so far." "It is scarcely so valueless as that paper money of ours at home, with which poor Nicholas Drury's strong-box is stuffed full," replied Michael. "Whatever this is worth, I intend to take the chance of carrying it with us. Where we are going, values and monies are things at which we can only guess." Monsieur Raoul Larocque, when he was told of the proposed expedition, threw his hands into the air in a true Gallic frenzy of horror and dismay. "Oh, my dear friend," he exclaimed almost in tears, "that you and your good captain and your noble ship should come to such an end as this! For you will never come back, and that is the one thing which the dullest eye can see. You will never come back." From this unhappy conviction he could not be moved by any encouraging argument which Michael could offer. Nor was Michael in his turn to be shaken in his resolution by any of the kindly Frenchman's offers to dissuade him. The friendly little man, even though he continued to deplore their rashness, proceeded to bend all his efforts toward helping them make proper preparations for the voyage. He found the most advantageous places for them to purchase the supplies they needed, insisted, with a wisdom for which they blessed him afterward, on their laying in a double and triple supply of the smooth green limes which are the sailor's defense against scurvy, and brought them speech here and there with seamen who chanced to have some knowledge of those coasts past which their projected course was to take them. Several had been in Montevideo, or had visited the Falkland Islands. A few knew something even of Valparaiso, and one whose more prosperous days had evidently known something of buccaneering talked of Coquimbo, a place even more distant, very rich with gold. It was not riches of just that sort which Michael was seeking, for he had stored in his hold a fairly good quantity of the Spanish silver dollars, the pieces of 8 for which he had sold his original cargo. These, so he understood, were more generally current in all the known ports of the world than any other form of money. With all the stray information which he could gather concerning the islands and harbors of the coast of South America, he found the sum of knowledge very scanty indeed. "People will know more after we come back," he observed cheerfully to Monsieur Larocque, and was touched to see the tears really standing now in the kind-hearted little man's eyes. "If you ever really reach the shores of China and arrive at Canton, the one port where foreign ships trade," he said, "it were wise for you to seek out a certain Chinese merchant whose heathen name, if I recollect it rightly, is Léon Cipon. A friend of mine who commanded one of the few French vessels which has voyaged to that port has told me of him as a man, in spite of his yellow face, of great honor and integrity, and having keen interest in building up their trade with nations whose sea is on the Atlantic." As a last office, Monsieur Larocque undertook to dispatch, by the first northbound ship leaving Port-au-Prince, the letter which Michael had written to Nicholas, setting forth with fiery ardor the plan and prospects for the Jocasta's voyage. Here was one, at least, who would share his enthusiasm, Michael felt as he wrote, letting his glowing dream expand for once, freed of the cold pressure of all the doubts which had surrounded him. "You will be many months without hearing from us again," he ended. "Oh, if only you could be sailing with us!" His letter to Nicholas, telling of their first arrival at Port-au-Prince, had been sent by a French brigantine bound for Baltimore. This second missive, the Frenchman promised, should be forwarded at the first opportunity. A Danish schooner, whose course was to lie through the Bahamas and touch at Norfolk, was the carrier of that letter. A gale off Cape Hatteras, a splintered wreck in the boiling surf, from which all hands were saved, but with vessel and cargo a total loss, could have told the tale of why the message never reached the hand for which it was meant. Michael by that time was below the equator, where the smooth heaving waters, which looked as though they were covered with oil, were giving way to the more turbulent seas which wash beyond the outthrust shoulder of South America and the port of Pernambuco. Nicholas, at home in Branscombe, looking out on the flying spray and loud-voiced surf of a January storm, could know as little as did Michael whither had gone that message into which one friend had put the whole of his eager heart for the comfort and reassurance of the other. Once past the Horn, the Pacific Sea proved itself true to that name which the Spanish explorers had so gratefully given it. The doubling of the Cape had seemed endless, even though it had lasted for no very great number of weeks. But this voyage across blue waters, sped by fresh and seldom failing breezes, seemed short in spite of the almost unbelievable number of miles which it finally covered. In the memories of all those voyagers, and in that of Michael in particular, there remained long after brief, vivid pictures of certain spots on that tremendous stretch of coast. There was Valparaiso, the shape of whose harbor, with its scattered rocks and breaker-washed islands, resembled somehow the harbor at Branscombe, save for the rugged mountains which made its background instead of the rolling hills checkered with little fields and dotted with clumps of pleasant wood. There was Callao, that port out of which had poured the treasures of the Incas, to be carried to Panama, there borne across the isthmus to be shipped for Spain, and so often to fall into the hands of buccaneers. Michael caught faintly hinted tales of those desperate marauders, stories which still haunted the sun-baked wharves of the sleepy Spanish cities. Then came the long northeastward reach past Central America and that rich province of New Spain which the ironed hand of Cortez had taken from the Montezumas. At last the palm-fringed coast, sometimes verdant, sometimes dry and barren, began to change into a region more familiar, with the dark green of pines showing amongst the tropical foliage, and with a clear, invigorating freshness in the air after the long, hot laziness of the tropics. Perhaps the most vivid impression of all those stamped upon Michael's mind was of a tremendous mountain, snow-clad at its summit, wrapped below in a dark green garment of pine forest, its base touching the sea, below a mile-wide slope of golden poppies. Or was there perhaps an even more telling memory of wreaths of fog which suddenly lifted before an onshore wind and showed an iron expanse of unbroken rocky cliffs, with breakers smashing below and splintering themselves into gigantic fountains of white spray? They had stopped here and there for water or for provisions as opportunity seemed to offer, but nowhere had they tarried long. Spaniards, brown natives, then Spaniards again, had regarded them with scarcely believing wonder. But now at last they swung into the wide mouth of an open harbor and dropped their anchor with a clatter and a splash, for they had seen a ship lying in the shadow of a green hill, and at her masthead flew the Stars and Stripes. The Columbia, out of Boston, had sailed some time before them, but had made so lengthy a voyage, touching even at the Cape Verde Islands, that she had not been so long in advance of them. What a shout went up from her decks as, here in this lost world, her crew saw a vessel of their own country come to anchor so close beside them. Boats were lowered from both ships almost on the instant, and came pulling across the deep green waters of the bay to meet halfway in such a clatter of excited greetings and questionings that, so Michael commented to Captain Douglas, it might have been a Branscombe lady's tea-drinking. As they approached the anchored ship, they could see that beyond her, in the shallower water near the shore, lay a smaller vessel which must be the sloop, the Lady Washington. Michael and the captain were received on board the Columbia with enthusiastic welcome by her commanding officer. There need be no question of trade rivalry here, for in that vast forested world there was room for all. The only question of success was seamanship and daring, and skill in the complicated mysteries of an entirely new commerce. "Did you ever for your sins attempt to bargain with a red Indian savage?" questioned Captain Kendrick, as they sat together in his cabin. "The patience of Job is the only one of the things necessary. The wisdom and quick wit of Solomon are needed also, as well as something of the courage and steadfastness of Daniel." While he was speaking, a quiet, pleasant-faced man had come down from the deck to join them, and was introduced as Captain Robert Gray, master of the consort sloop, Lady Washington. He had smiled on hearing his colleague's comment on the difficulties of negotiation with the neighboring inhabitants. "Like other tasks, it requires some practice and knowledge to carry on trade for furs," he declared. "Although I admit it seems to me that it would take a long lifetime to learn to understand the strange moods and fancies of these Northwest Indians. They are eager for friendly trade with us, and yet smolderingly hostile beneath their appearance of peace. They do not yet know whether they will get the more by offering us seal or otter skins, or by attempting, at some opportune moment, to swarm aboard and massacre us, and take possession of our stores. Behind those stolid red faces, it seems to me that I can see them continually turning over that vexed question within their minds." "What have you brought for exchanging with them?" Captain Douglas inquired. The answer of the commander of the Columbia was accompanied by a groan and followed by a broad grin upon the face of his companion. "They said in Boston that Indians were like children, so that those wise men who launched our ventures sent us hither with the most of our stock made up," his tone of disgust told an unhappy story, "made up of rattles and Jews' harps. The red men, after the curiosity of the first moment, will have none of them." The comment of Captain Douglas was in a voice almost as disheartened. I doubt whether we have done any better. Michael, can you show him some of that treasure which you have chosen to carry round the Horn for the tempting of these far-off savages?" Michael plunged his hand into his pocket and produced a sample of the much-disputed shell. The two men of the Columbia bent their heads to examine it, then looked first at each other and then at the red-haired young man before them in startled amazement. "Great heaven, lad!" ejaculated Captain Kendrick. "How did you come to know of that? Whenever a new chief comes to trade with us, he first pulls out some little ornament made of just such shells as these, and asks, hopefully by signs, whether, since we came from the southward, we have brought anything like that. Their faces always fall when we must say no." They fell to explaining at some length the difficulties which they had met with in bartering with the Indians. Metal for spear and arrowheads was what the red men most greatly desired, but as this had not been foreseen, the amount of the iron and copper which the two vessels could spare had quickly been exhausted. The Indians had abundance of furs to sell, but the slow process of exchange seemed to make the gathering of a cargo an interminable task. One tribe and another would send their warriors in canoes, either to where the Columbia lay or to the Lady Washington, who, with her lighter draft, could seek out the shallower bays and mouths of the rivers. Each group of red men would have sometimes a score, sometimes 50 or 60 pelts of sea otter and seal, with an offering besides of the less valuable skins of the land, otter, elk, mink, and wolf. Since there was no fixed price, the process of trade was intricate and laborious. Certain of the Indians would exchange their wares for anything which happened to take their fancy, while certain shrewder tribes knew enough to hold out for the highest possible price. "We have brought a quantity of beads, yet even these were many of them unfortunate as to color. Blue ones are far more acceptable than red, for some reason, and white worth very little. We have happened to provide far more of the red than of any other kind, but when we offer them, the Indians shake their heads and insist that they must have the blue." This was the information which Captain Kendrick gave, while Captain Gray added to it facts of graver import. Much of this he offered while he was rowing back to the Jocasta with Michael, for the sake of fetching some supplies and medicines which it was arranged that the vessels were to exchange. A great many of the savages are well convinced that it would be the simplest matter of getting what they desire to fall upon us and take it, as is their fashion with their enemies. They fear our guns somewhat, but not so greatly as one might suppose. But the principal chief of this neighborhood has managed to get through his savage mind the knowledge that we might return to our own country and then come back again to trade with him further, so that it would be short-sighted policy to make an end of us now. Yet it is plain to see that the temptation to destroy us is sometimes almost greater than they can resist. Of all the advice which I can give you, hearken to this with your greatest heed. Never let more than a dozen of their warriors be upon your ship at the same time. They will come in scores and hundreds to trade, and they will profess great indignation if you keep them waiting in their canoes, but of that you need take no account. If at any time when their boats are lying about you, and you observe that they are sending the women ashore, then deal out your muskets and cutlasses and run out your guns, for there is going to be a battle." He gave directions to the men at the oars to pull the boat close inshore past a jutting outcrop of rocks partly hidden by a turn in the curve of the beach. Shattered against the great boulders and wedged in their iron hold lay the remains of a ship, a brig perhaps she had once been, or one of the older two-masted vessels which men called snows. Some fluttering rags of canvas still clung to her yards, but her broken timbers covered with barnacles showed how long she had lain there in the rising and falling tide. What was she? A British trader or a Russian seal hunter's vessel, perhaps, Captain Gray said. A few of them reached these coasts after a voyage out from China, and returned across the Pacific to sell their seal and otter in the port of Canton. Here is one which met misfortune, though how long ago I am not certain. And what has become of her men? Michael asked. There can be little doubt of what was their fate, the other replied. Once they were helpless, the Indians had their way with both men and ship. One hears ghastly tales of the wreckers on the coasts of our own Atlantic seas, and of how little mercy they sometimes show to those unfortunates whom the tempest has cast into their hands. And these Indians, can we believe that they would be less ruthless? Make careful choice of your anchorage. If your ship be torn from her moorings or be driven upon any rock or shoal, the end will come very quickly. They turned their bow toward the Jocasta, and Captain Gray, as his eye traveled over her finely modeled hull and tall masts, announced with conviction, I would stake almost anything that it was Thomas Drury who built that ship. It was Nicholas Drury instead, Michael told him, speaking his friend's name with glowing pride. He related the tale of how the Jocasta had been sent to sea, and Robert Gray nodded in pleased understanding. The men who financed us chanced to be among the few who still had money behind them, and yet ours was thought to be a bold venture, he said. What was it then for the Drurys, uncle and nephew, and for a little community like Branscombe, where so much had been lost by the fortunes of the sea? Such courage deserves success, and with all my heart I hope and believe that it will come to you. A few days later the Jocasta sailed to seek out another stretch of coast, and there to begin trading on her own account. The men of the Columbia and the Lady Washington gave them every information they could concerning headlands and harbors, rocks and shoals, but for the most part the cruise was a matter of feeling the way, of standing well out to sea and then coming in with great precaution in sounding. Wherever some cleft in the hills suggested the mouth of a river or a possible port, they chose at last for their anchorage an irregular bay, sheltered from the worst of the west and southwest winds, with a broad river pouring into it, whose wooded banks wound far away and disappeared into mountains. Even as the Jocasta slid into the harbor and came to rest at her moorings, her crew could see moving figures upon the shore, and copper-brown faces peering out at them from among the trees. The very next day a few venturesome canoes came skimming out to the ship's side, and their navigators, both men and women, scrambled aboard. All carried rolled-up bundles of skins, and all were brought down into that portion of the space below which had been taken for a trade room. Michael, his heart beating high with excitement, since he was now to put all his knowledge and skill to the test, strove to match the unmoving faces of the savages with a countenance as non-committal as their own. He could see one or two of the warriors and the squaws whispering together and casting glances of wonder at his flaming hair. A word was passing from one to another whose meaning must undoubtedly be red. Behind him Charles Brigham stood ready to assist him, waiting with the very obvious doubts to see how the first negotiations would end. The leader, a chief whose name had been stated to be Wickananish, came forward to stand by the table. He was not built like the Seminole Indians with whom Michael was familiar, being shorter and less gracefully made, with smaller and more irregular features, and with heavy feet and legs not quite straight. His clothing was uncouth and scanty, a tattered garment of skins flung carelessly about his shoulders and fastened at the neck by a sinew cord. Yet the torn cloak-like dress had, when new, been made of supple, lustrous otter skin. He flung down a deep, rich pelt of the same fur before Michael and looked at him with a calculating, avaricious glance which plainly said, "How much?" The look of greed is the same in any man's eyes, regardless of blood or color. The narrow-eyed scrutiny was extraordinarily similar to that which Michael had once before observed on the face of Joseph Ryle. Michael, holding his rarest commodity in reserve, brought forth specimens of all those other things which he had ready for exchange. First, a handful of silver dollars, then tobacco, some big glass beads, and some lengths of red and blue cloth. The man examined them carefully, not showing the least enthusiasm over anything. He made signs to indicate that they were a very poor tribe and had only a small quantity of furs to offer. Then he indicated what amount of tobacco or beads or scarlet duffel cloth he would take for the otter skin. The price was absurdly high even in that rough medium of barter. In some disappointment, Michael pondered the problem of exchange. He, in turn, made a sign to express his disapprobation, whereat the Indian, with a complete air of indifference, rolled up the skin as though the discussion were over. The group behind him gathered together as if for departure, since evidently the word of their chief was to be their only guide in the matter. Michael, whose move it now was in this odd, silent game, leaned over the table and pointed to the chain of bear's claws which hung about the man's neck. There was apparently some ornament at the end of it, which was concealed beneath his garment. This, so Michael made him understand by signs, he would like to see. The man hesitated, then finally thrust his hand beneath the fur and pulled out a dangling object, which he held up with a look of pride and condescension as though to declare, "You have nothing like this." Back of his shoulder, Michael could hear Charles Brigham draw a sudden breath. It was surely almost like the latter end of a fairy tale to see the man produce a round ornament fashioned from the slim, pointed shells of the true wampum. With careful deliberation and with no betrayal of any feeling, he himself brought out a small box, lifted the cover, and showed the Red Chief that it was full of the same shell. Against every habit and tradition of a warrior's proper bearing, the man cried out in joyful wonder. The others came crowding to his side to look and peer and jabber amongst themselves, while one of them, moved by irresistible desire, reached forward to take the treasure from the white trader's hand. Michael stepped back, immediately on guard, while Charles Brigham moved up to array himself beside his friend. The flurry of excitement was over in an instant, however, and the Indians had regained their self-possession. Their leader, by means of signs which he had to repeat for the white men to understand, was asking the question, "Have you more of this?" That it might be understood at once that the trading was to be on a large scale, Michael opened one of the chests beside the wall and showed that it was full to the brim with wampum. He indicated 2 other oaken boxes and a row of big canvas bags, all of which he made them understand were filled with the desired riches. He scarcely liked the look of crafty delight which spread over the face of Wickananish, and the glance he exchanged with his followers, who had clustered behind to gape over their leader's shoulder. Perhaps that was not quite wise, he noted within himself, but forgot his misgiving in the magical result which the sight of the wampum had produced. Skins and furs immediately appeared from under every cloak. They who had professed themselves as so poor in goods produced them now in generous quantity. The squaws were sent back to the canoes to bring even more, and finally were dispatched to the shore to fetch some reserve store which the crafty traders had not at first thought it wise to bring with them. At this move Michael conveyed a stern order by means of gesture. If the women went, the men must go also. The chief gave him an angry, cunning glance, having in it, however, some reluctant respect. Such white men as he had met before had not been quite so keen-eyed to see possible peril. He departed with his warriors and presently returned with such an abundance of the furry coats of seal, otter, beaver, and wolf that the trade-room table was presently piled high with the spoils, and every Indian had paddled away completely satisfied. With such brisk exchange as this, Michael reported joyfully to Captain Douglas, we should have a sufficient cargo of seal and otter within a month. The problem of dealing with Indian nature was, nevertheless, not so easily simple as he had believed. Once the red men were convinced that the supply of wampum shells was actually real, once each had satisfied his lifelong desire to own a handful of the treasure, the process of negotiation assumed a new aspect. For a few days no Indians came, as though they were sitting at their own firesides, exulting in their strange riches. Then, at length, having gathered more furs, possibly by barter or pressure among their neighbors, they returned to the task of exchange. Through Wickananish, their spokesman, they announced firmly that the price had risen. In the first transaction, 1 cupful of the shell had been exchanged for 2 otter skins. It was now made plain that the order was reversed, 2 cups full for a single pelt of otter, with the other prices in proportion. Michael shook his head in refusal. Wickananish shook his in obstinate determination. He had brought more warriors with him than before, but of these only half a dozen were suffered to come on board the Jocasta. In spite of grunts and grumbles and attempted exchange of argument, neither side would give way. There was no trading that day. They returned next morning to open negotiations again. This time the price asked was 3 times the first. Michael refused emphatically, and exchange came definitely to a standstill. Then, the word apparently having traveled through the country that Wickananish's village had been trafficking with the whites for the greatly valued wampum, other Indians began to bring their wares to market. They came dropping down the river in small fleets of dug-out canoes and paddled alongside the Jocasta, sometimes with anxious glances cast over their shoulders toward the shore. A few of them expressed desire to trade for other things, for men vary even in such alien races. Some are thrifty, and some merely desire the possessions which will count them as wealthy in the eyes of their neighbors. When such commerce had gone on for a little time, it was suddenly interrupted. Charles Brigham sent down from his early morning watch to arouse the captain and Michael at dawn. "There is nothing really wrong," he admitted, "but there are things going forward on the shore which I do not like, more stirring and peering amongst the trees than ever before, and then suddenly nobody, and not even the smoke of a campfire. There is something brewing." They could only wait, listen, and conjecture, while they watched that stretch of wooded shore about the mouth of the river, where their red neighbors had of late gone so openly about their business of hunting and cooking, of skinning and tanning. Yet after long silence and listening, first Michael, then the others heard a faint sound which grew and gathered volume, and carried to them down the wind a message of terrible burden. Every sailor dropped his work and came to the rail to listen. There is no one who can ever mistake the meaning of that cry, the swelling, triumphant yell of the Indian war-whoop. "It is a long way off," said Captain Douglas, and Michael added quickly, "I believe it is not for us. They are fighting those Indians who have come to trade and are driving them back into the hills." They made preparation for possible battle, and rested half a day upon their arms. But it seemed that Michael had indeed guessed the truth, for whenever they heard renewed that death-heralding cry, it was fainter and at a greater distance. The hot sun lay over the green landscape and the rising wooded hills. The water of the bay lapped softly about them, and nowhere was there sign of what might be the outcome of that struggle going forward so many miles away. When noon had passed, the crew of the Jocasta returned to their various occupations, though still with eyes and ears alert. Toward sunset, an object came floating and bobbing round the curve of the river and drifted out into the bay. The men of the Jocasta lowered a boat and brought it in, a smashed canoe bearing a slain Indian whose garments and headdress showed that he was not of that immediate tribe which dwelt so close to them. By sunrise next day the campfires were burning in their accustomed place. The warriors were going back and forth amongst the trees. The women were chattering together at the waterside. There seemed no indication that anything out of the way had happened, except for one thing. The traders from the more distant dwelling tribes, whose canoes had once lain about the Jocasta in hundreds, now came no more. Captain Douglas had the long boat fitted with mast and provisions, and sent her with Charles Brigham and a selected crew to explore the nearby coast and seek out another anchorage for the Jocasta and another place for trade. They returned with the report that nowhere within several days' cruise was there a proper harbor for their ship, and that farther north the land seemed so barren and uninhabited that it was scarcely worth establishing another center for traffic in skins. "We would only have the same difficulty over again. We may as well wear the problem to an end here," declared Captain Douglas, and his two officers agreed with him. For a few weeks it was possible, by cruising up and down the coast in the longboat, to gather furs from the villagers on the little bays and islands or along the shores of the rivers. Evidently everyone had heard of the Jocasta, and at first all came eagerly to exchange their goods for tobacco, cloth, and shell. But in every place the activity was short-lived. The men would begin to either demand twice and 3 times the original price, mounting far beyond what was possible for Michael to pay in trade goods, or else they would shake their heads and indicate that they had nothing more to offer. "There was one copper-faced ruffian," fumed Charles Brigham, who had become as eager and enthusiastic for the trade as Michael himself, "who told me yesterday, in that single word quancum, which I have learned all too well means nothing more, that there were no more pelts to be obtained, and at the very moment, instead of the ragged skins in which he was clothed yesterday, he was wrapped in a garment of new tan furs that would have graced a king's coronation feast. He swung it about him with an air of majesty as he walked away, but he looked back over his shoulder to make note of my discomfiture." Day after day passed with neither buyers nor sellers willing to retire from the position each had taken. Outwardly all was pleasantly peaceful between the white men on the Jocasta and their dusky neighbors. The Indians brought salmon, deer, and bear meat to trade for cloth and beads. They introduced the newcomers to wapatu, the pleasant-tasting root of the swamp plant arrowhead. They even produced in time such inferior skins as those of raccoon, elk, or fox. It was plainly understood on both sides that it was only in the matter of that principal item of trade, seal and otter fur, that there was to be no compromise. Often those from the Jocasta went ashore to hunt, Michael being the most enthusiastic and the most skillful sportsman among them. Timothy Tripp liked to accompany him, so that together these two learned to know much of that densely wooded stretch of country which reached from the sea to the mountains. They were never tired of tramping through the shady glades, of wondering at the enormous size of the trees, of hiding in the underbrush and watching the bears come with their shambling and rolling walk down to the edge of the river to feed on huckleberries or to wade in shoulder deep and snap up the salmon which went swimming past. Timothy Tripp developed great dexterity at making himself understood by the Indians in their own sign language, and had even grown to be on something like friendly terms with one or two amongst them. Michael came upon him one day dining pleasantly with a grizzled warrior, his squaw, and 2 young sons. The woman had made some kind of savory stew of meat and wappatoo, which she had cooked in one of their curious pots of closely woven grass, in which, since they cannot be set over the fire, the food and water were heated by dropping in hot stones. Michael arrived just as the meal was ended, and as the Red household, who were on a hunting expedition of their own, were preparing to move onward, the squaw emptied the cooking pot and set it upside down upon her head, since it served as a hat during the time that it was not needed for the preparation of dinner. Tripp regarded the action with some dismay, as though it threw a cloud over the pleasant memory of the dinner which he had just consumed. "I wonder just what was the meat she cooked for us," he speculated rather anxiously. "Probably wildcat or muskrat," Michael suggested, at which his companion gave a rueful grin. The experience, however, did not seem to quench his sociable instinct, for a few days later Michael once more discovered him in the company of a new acquaintance, this time a single young brave. The Indian had cut down a big fir trunk and was fashioning it into a canoe, a slow and laborious process with his clumsy tools of stone or copper. Timothy Tripp was hewing away with his big hunting knife, helping the man and talking to him busily, although he was entirely unable to make himself understood. He had somehow, however, gathered a knowledge of the other's plans and hopes, for he told Michael that the canoe was to be an especially choice one, since the Indian was making it for the purpose of winning himself a wife. It was the established custom that when a young warrior desired an Indian maiden in marriage, he must offer to her father a canoe in exchange for her. The lonely-hearted Timothy, thinking forlornly of his faraway Henrietta, seemed to feel much in common with the young bridegroom-to-be, whose name, it appeared, was Hanno, and was aiding him with all his heart. For a number of days he went ashore, bringing tools from the ship to help his new friend with such absorbed zeal that Michael was left to hunt and fish alone. Many were Michael's thoughts of his faraway friend in those long still hours which he spent lying in wait for shy deer or wary salmon, listening to the vast whispering silence of the forest around him. How he would have liked to show it all to Nicholas. How he wondered as to what his friend might be doing and thinking. He had left his partner to a single-handed struggle against great odds, against difficult fortunes, and against the enmity of Darius Courland. Did things go well with him or ill? Were those about him beginning to murmur that the voyage of the Jocasta had already lasted for almost a year, with no news of her save that she had sought out the unknown northwest coast? It would be hard for Nicholas for a little longer, but how it would all be made up to him 1,000-fold. What a day it would be when the Jocasta, after trading her furs in China for teas and silks, should come back rejoicing with the riches of the Orient in her hold. Even though these sullen Indians were for the present ruining all chance of profit in the voyage, Michael's brilliant hopes would suffer no thought of the possibility of defeat. There were other fancies and recollections also, those which held the dancing image of Dolly Drury, Dolly, who toiled as industriously and devotedly as her brother, yet to whom the world with its changing fortunes seemed always a matter for laughter rather than misgiving or dismay. How Dolly would have loved the boundless beauty of this vast country with its forest and mountains, its wildflowers blooming so abundantly in the soft, wet air, its bright birds and its brimming streams. That unexplored wilderness which lay between them might have been the gulf between two planets, so impossible was it for any word or message to pass to that pair on the rugged shores of New England from their red-haired comrade sitting on a great fallen log in the midst of a pathless wood, thinking of them in such absorption that presently a large and over-hungry salmon threatened to jerk his fish-line from his hand. It had been past midsummer when the Jocasta had first come upon the shores of northwestern America. It was autumn now. Not the brisk, windy autumn of New England, but a warm, wet season which hid the hills and mountains in low-hanging veils of cloud and rain. The Indians had finally made one more offering of furs, this time for thrice the amount first demanded, instead of 4 times greater, as had been their last suggestion. There had been black looks when Michael declined, but as yet no signs of real hostility. There was, nevertheless, an indefinable change in their attitude, a sulky watchfulness which had not been there before. "They seem to be waiting for something," observed Timothy Tripp, although he had come to know more of them than did any of the others. Not even he could guess what it might be. A little later storms began to fall upon them, great booming winds sweeping in from the sea to lash their little harbor into a welter of whitecaps. Captain Douglas for the first time began to seem doubtful. "We can never ride out the winter here," he declared, "and it begins to appear that we will not have a complete cargo before spring." Michael exclaimed in dismay. Such long delay as that seemed to his impatient spirit impossible to endure. Yet within their hold were packed away only a little over 900 fur pelts, while his lowest estimate of a full lading called for 2,000. Charles Brigham refrained from adding gloom to the situation by any grumbling or harking back to the warnings which he had once uttered. He was one of those who voices all his doubts at the beginning of an enterprise, then, having once made up his mind to embark upon it, does not look behind him. All his attention seemed to be centered now upon the proper handling of the Jocasta in case of even heavier storms. "In a stronger gale than this we would have to slip our cable and put to sea," he declared. "It would never do to drag anchor, for we would be driven upon the bar." The mouth of the river, broad and deep as the stream was for a number of miles, would have offered them safe sanctuary if it had not been for that narrow but impassable barrier. Many times they had rowed up and down and across it, sounding everywhere in the hope of finding some deeper scoured channel where their ship might cross. But even at the height of the tide, the water on the bar was definitely too shallow for a vessel of the Jocasta's draft. Their neighbors, the Indians, proved themselves even more excellent boatmen than had at first appeared. Heavy swells in the bay, choppy and turbulent seas between the river banks, seemed to make small difference to their weather-wise canoes. They still came paddling out to the Jocasta with such wares as they had been accustomed to bring, yet it was plain that their manner of scowling ill will was verging more and more upon open hatred. "They are like children who have been denied something that they want," Charles Brigham said, but Michael shook his head. "He who counts upon the childlike nature of the savage is betrayed to his undoing," he returned. "Children are neither crafty nor ferocious, and these men can no longer hide the fact that they are both." A certain afternoon came with still but heavily brooding weather when a party of men were sent ashore to fetch water. Formerly this task had been gone through almost every day, one or two of the crew being sent out alone to accomplish it. Now the captain, who had put an end to the hunting expeditions of Michael and Trip, had also decreed that a good number of men must always go ashore together, and that as many casks as possible should be taken in the longboat and filled up at extended intervals. On this day he had accompanied the party himself, taking Michael with him and leaving Charles Brigham in charge of the Jocasta. There was no sign of an Indian anywhere, even though the path by which they went back and forth to the accustomed pool of clear water led close past Wickananish's village. The men were glad to be on land and made rather a long task than was necessary, laughing and joking and dallying over their work, in no haste to bring it to an end. Finally, the captain, waiting in the boat, sent word to Michael, superintending beside the pool, that they were to make greater speed, since there was bad weather in sight. Hard on the heels of this messenger came another running. The captain ordered that they were to leave everything and come immediately to the shore, or the storm would break before they could get back to the ship. The tide was at its height, and it would be difficult to launch a boat should they delay until it dropped. Even then it was in a laughing rush that the men went streaming along the wooded path, laughter which, however, failed suddenly as they came out upon the beach and saw the dark angry sky and the flaws of wind upon the water, swift moving and almost black as they came skimming across the surface of the bay. They tumbled in, pushed off the heavily laden boat, and bent to their oars. "See the Jocasta," said a sailor, peering backward over his shoulder. "Mr. Brigham seems to be certain she cannot ride the storm at her anchor." The ship was tossing uneasily at her moorings, and was getting up her foresail for the purpose of necessary flight. "Here comes the wind," shouted Captain Douglas, who was at the tiller. At almost the same moment, Michael, facing him and pulling the stroke oar, gave an astounded exclamation, while the seaman just back of his shoulder cried out in open terror, "Look, look, the Indians are on us!" From behind headlands and rocks, from the concealment even of big-rooted stumps and logs at the edge of the water, the canoes came streaming out. How such a number could have remained so completely hidden was impossible to guess. There were no squaws among them now. Every flashing paddle was wielded by a brave. Every boat had kneeling in the bow a fully armed warrior with a drawn bow. For this they had waited through weeks and months, had bided their time as only Indians can, until there should arise just the situation for which they were looking, wind and storm and a divided crew. Now the great moment had come. Now all around the circle of the bay, echoing back from the rock and slope and forest wall, rose again the hideous pulsating war whoop. A shower of spears and arrows flew like hail upon the men pulling for their lives toward the ship. "Michael, take the helm!" The captain spoke the words thickly and slipped in a heap to the bottom of the boat. Michael stepped across him, grasped the tiller, and brought the staggering boat into the wind, just as she was almost swamped in the trough of the heaving sea. The tempest had broken about them. The wind was roaring and screaming about their ears. Fitful gusts of rain were driving over them, and through the squalls they could see the Jocasta rearing and plunging as she tore at her anchor. Very dimly Michael could make out that a small figure in the bow was swinging round the first of her guns. Others were running to join him. The Indians, however, seemed to make immediate note of the same thing, and plainly by prearranged plan they strung out their uneven line of attacking canoes parallel to the longboat and laying a course which would keep it between them and the ship. If the Jocasta were to use her guns, she would be far more likely to slay her own men than any of the wily enemy. A second rain of arrows fell upon them, and a seaman amidships dropped his oar and fell sprawling across the thwarts. A yell of triumph went up from the red warriors, and the canoes began to circle close. "Give me my rifle," Michael directed. His was the only weapon in the party. While the man nearest him reached over to steady the tiller, he stood up, swaying with the motion of the boat, hearing the arrows sing past his ears, but taking unhurried aim. A feather-decked warrior was just opposite, leaning far over the bow of his dancing craft, with his bow bent and the arrow drawn to his ears. At the crack of the rifle, the brave uttered a shrill cry and tumbled forward, upsetting the canoe. As a great wave curved down upon it, the small boat and its two warriors vanished. A swarm of canoes drew away a little, but a second sailor was down, and the longboat was being driven off her course and toward the shore. Michael, in desperate haste, fell to reloading his gun. "See!" cried the man who was holding the tiller. "The Jocasta!" As they came to the top of the wave, Michael looked up and involuntarily cried out, "Ah, good Charles Brigham!" The mate left in charge, short-handed as he was, and with a part even of the small number of men engaged with the guns, had nevertheless executed a masterly maneuver. He had slipped his cable, got way upon the ship, and rounded in toward shore, so that instead of lying broadside to the longboat and the canoes, he was cutting across their bows. The water boiled beneath the Jocasta's prow, as in the furious wind she went tearing past them. A flash and a puff of smoke went up from the first gun and then the second. 1, 2, 3. The heavy reports echoed back from the same rocks and slopes where the war whoop had just fallen silent. With every shot a canoe splintered, upended, and sank amid shouts of defiance and rage, while the tumbling waves became dotted suddenly with bobbing heads. Again she shot, and again as she raced forward. The canoes were faltering and dropping astern. "She'll be ashore!" cried the sailor at the tiller. At tremendous speed the Jocasta was swinging about to come into the wind and beat out of danger. But the force of the tempest was too heavy, for at just that instant she came opposite the mouth of the bay, where the gale fell upon her with its full fury. Michael saw her lifted high, tilting and staggering, still seeming to struggle back to her safe course, then saw her flung broadside to upon the bar of the river. She faltered, careened, and was caught by another tremendous sea, huge and combing a wave with its feet on the bottom. Even at that distance, Michael thought he could hear the rasping sound of her keel scraping upon the gravel as she caught for a moment and then slid over it into the deeper water of the river. The longboat pulled alongside as she rocked in calmer waters. The Jocasta was over. She was safe, but imprisoned behind the bar. And where was any force to be found that would set her free again? End of chapter 9.